Okay. Welcome back to the Atomic Comic. Welcome back to the Atomic. Welcome back to the Atomic Comic Pile, where I, a nuclear medicine technologist, reads the comics no one else does. So we're going to start this episode off with New Fun, the Big Comic Magazine, February 1935. This was actually released on January 11th, 1935. Now it is 10 inches by 15 inches. This is the actual size that the comic book came out in. This is the very first time it has ever been reprinted. This came out in 2020 in this hardcover form. Now, as you can see here, this gigantic comic, the cover price was 10 cents. Now, if you adjust that for inflation, it would be $1.87 now. Well, right here on the cover, you can see the size of a modern comic book. And a modern comic book costs $4.99. So prices are a lot more expensive now. It's crazy. So anyways, this was the very first comic book ever released with all original material. See, at the time, when this came out, there was only one other monthly comic. It was called Famous Funnies, and it had just begun 6 months before, back in 1934. And it reprinted newspaper comic strips. It was just reprints. This was the first publication from National Allied Publications, which is the company that would become DC Comics. So we begin with two different introductions for this reprint publication. And this right here is a scan of the January 11th, 1935 handwritten letter from the editor that was inserted into some copies of the original version of this comic book. And here is the original cover. This is Jack Woods. He's a Texas Ranger, and he helps others in need and takes on Pancho Villa in the last years of the Old West before World War I. Now, being on the cover basically makes him DC Comics' first hero. It was written by Major Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson and illustrated by Lyman Anderson. And his story would run until September of 1939, and then he was never seen again. Now, right here on the inside cover, they ask you to cut out this coupon for a prize. If you cut it out, it removes 2 panels of Jack Wood's story. Who's going to do that? Probably everybody did. Now, page 1 is Sandra of the Secret Service. The interior comics are in black and white, and like the cover, only 1 page apiece. They were also designed like newspaper strips, so they don't fit perfectly to the page, and they leave a gap at the bottom, and that has been filled with Oswald the Rabbit. Now, Oswald was, of course, the character created by Walt Disney before he made Mickey Mouse. This is after the character was taken away from him and necessitated him creating Mickey Mouse. But here you go. So, Sandra is DC Comics' first heroine, and as a member of the Secret Service, her mission is to protect the nation's leaders and safeguard the financial infrastructure of the United States. She battles spies and arms manufacturers and only lasted until September of 1938, a few months after Superman's debut. I find the 1-page format to be too abbreviated. They end on cliffhangers as soon as they get started. I would find it difficult to follow a storyline with a month between each page. Jigger and Ginger. Jigger is a high school boy that works at a gas station, and Ginger is his girlfriend, who he keeps losing to their mutual friend Kip. This first installment has a funny ending, but the next issue is the first part to a new storyline that never resolves because the strip never appeared again. Not a big loss. Barry O'Neill, DC Comics' first modern action hero. Wealthy, independent playboy adventurer, teamed with the chief of the French Secret Service to battle the Chinese gang leader Fang Gao and the assassin Fu Yak. His strip ran for 6 years. He returned in the January 2017 Batman Annual Volume 3, Number 1, where he died. The Magic Crystal of History. This strip tells different tales from history and lasted the first 50 issues of this comic. Check out Bobby telling his sister Binks, "Gee Willikins!" Everybody talks like that. Wing Brady, Soldier of Fortune, a pilot and secret agent for the French Foreign Legion in North Africa. His strip ran for 5 years, ending 2 issues after the Magic Crystal of History. Ivanhoe, an adaptation of the public domain novel by Sir Walter Scott from 1820. It ran for 2 years. Oswald the Rabbit, who had been trying to ice skate at the bottom of each page and always falling over, finally stops falling here in his last page in the comic. Judge Perkins. Lame. Lasted 2 issues. That's 2 pages, mind you. But you can see it fills the entire page. Maybe from this point on, they were drawing it for this publication as opposed to drawing it for a newspaper and then it not making it into a newspaper. Don Drake on the planet Sorrow. DC's first science fiction series. It's fun. It's generic Flash Gordon stuff. I like the art, but it would work better in color. Loco Luke, another Western. Looks like it was drawn for small children. Lasted 4 appearances. And here we have Spook Ranch. It's written by Ken Fitch using the pen name Roger Furlong. It's a 2-page prose story with 2 illustrations about a cowboy named Vic Riley. I read it, and I liked it. Maybe more than anything else in the whole comic so far. It ends on a cliffhanger, and the story concludes in the next issue. And I don't have the next issue, so I guess I'll never get to read it! Scrub Hardy. It's an old hobo-looking kid that gets roughed up while playing basketball. It lasted for 2 appearances. Jack Andrews, All-American Boy. A high school kid plays football, and someone tampers with the big game. 6 appearances. Now we get a short story about Dr. Bieb in the Bathysphere. Now, this was a real thing. It's like an unpowered 2-man submarine with viewing windows, which submarines of the time did not have. It had been around for about 5 years at this point, and had just set the record for the deepest dive by humans. It's written like a news article, and Bieb's Bathysphere exploits were in the news, except here it says that underwater he would see baby dragons, armored knights of Neptune, and flame fighters. I don't think that made it into the news. I don't think that part was real. Maybe I'm wrong. And here we have the very first full comic ad by Charles Atlas of the guy at the beach getting sand kicked in his face. A sports article about the history of hockey going back to ancient Greece. And it mentions the World War. Not World War I, because this is still 7 years before there would be a World War II. And an ad for making money at home, growing mushrooms. An ad about becoming a successful detective. And another mail-away workout program cartoon ad. But it's titled, Jack Puts One Over on His Boyfriend? What? Here we've got articles where Fun, the name of this magazine, brings you all the latest on the radio and in the movies. Now, on the radio was Buck Rogers, but in the movies was a new serial about to start, all about none other than our cover boy himself, Jack Woods. Now, they called it Rustlers of Red Gap, and it was starring Johnny Mac Brown, but it seems to have been renamed Rustlers of the Red Dog, and the first of its 12 chapters came out on January 21st, 1935, just 10 days after this comic book hit the newsstands. Now, this comic would have been made in the last half of 1934, and so would that movie serial. So I'm thinking this comic must have been made as some kind of a tie-in for the film, and that's why it's on the cover. They had to come up with some reason to get new readers to try out a comic that didn't have strips that everyone already liked from the newspapers. Right? Well, I bought that movie serial, and in Chapter 5, there's a scene where Jack and his two friends are captured by Native Americans, and he makes a deal with them to give him back his gun with only 2 bullets in it, so that he can kill his own friends quick and clean, instead of letting them burn him at the stake. And in return, they can boil him alive and eat him. Fortunately, they were all saved by a timely horse stampede, but man, that Jack Woods, what a tough dude! So we've got instructions on how to build model aircraft, an article about aviation, and reducing your own waistline, instructions on how to build a model boat, and an ad for razors. Talking about boats, we got Cap'n Eric. Boat sabotage as 2 ships try to make it first to an island where they can hunt seals. It lasted 2 issues. Buckskin Jim the Trailblazer. Cowboys, Indians, and the frontier life of the 1840s. It ran for 2 years. Fun! More articles, popular science, stamps and coin collecting. And one for young homemakers where women can learn how to keep an organized kitchen because it's the most important room of the house for them to be in. Because that's where they belong, kids. After school. Street kids in the Depression getting up to no good. The main character, Lefty, wears a hat like Jughead from Archie Comics. 6 years before, there was a Jughead from Archie Comics. Lasted 6 issues. Caveman Capers. Cavemen speak like 1930s era Americans. Gee whiz, what a cold and unfriendly world I stepped into. Gosh, Ma will be worried and Pa will be sore if I don't return soon. Lasted 5 issues. Fun films. This is kind of cool. I had a few Cracker Jack prizes like this when I was a kid. You cut the strips out and you slide them through this viewer to simulate watching a film. It's a good way to destroy your comic. Bubby and Beevil. Bubby is a good imp and Beevil is evil. Bubby does a good deed and Beevil tries to ruin it. Well, except Bubby's deed was to do a kid's homework for him while he slept. Beevil dumped ink all over it, making the kid have to do his homework himself. I'd say Bubby was the bad imp and Beevil was the good imp. Fail! Lasted 3 issues. Pelion and Ossa. A penguin drags a baby polar bear around on unwanted adventures at the North Pole. Maybe it's cute for little kids. In issue 10, it'd be expanded to 2 pages, and it ran for 2 years. Pelion and Ossa also happen to be the names of 2 mountains in Greece. And lastly, 2023 Super Police. Ending on a real high note here. Just the name alone is exciting. It's written by Ken Fitch and illustrated by Clem Greta, which is the same team that made Don Drake on the Planet Sorrow and Spook Ranch, which was the best story in the whole book. Okay, here we have Rex Cosmos and the Super Police testing out their new airplane that turns into a submarine when they receive a distress call from off the coast of the Galapagos Islands. This only ran for 14 issues. Man, wouldn't it be cool if DC Comics made a one-shot comic return of the 2023 Super Police next year in 2023? Okay, a final ad for model planes. And, oh, I spoke too soon. Another comic. Tom Mix and his Ralston Straight Shooters. An advertisement of the Ralston Purina Company. Okay, so it's another ad, but in the form of a comic story. Like the Hostess Fruit Pie ads. So this is another cowboy story, and Tom Mix was a real guy. He was a silent film actor in almost 300 westerns, and Ralston Purina sponsored his radio show. And this is an advertisement by them for a breakfast cereal and a toy prize that's used in the story. Tom Mix died in a car accident 5 years after this ad, and would later have 161 comic books made about him. And so we finish with some bios. Major Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson, the man that established National Allied Publications, created this, the first comic book with all original material, at 44 years old, and hired teenagers Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster to create Superman. His life is so interesting they should make a movie out of it. And there's bios for all the writers, artists, editors, and more for this book. Cool! Then we have an article about the lineage of this 2020 publication. Starting in 1972, DC Comics began publishing these large tabloid-sized reprints of significant comics from their history as an homage to the original size of these first publications, which were printed this big because the printing presses were set up to print newspaper comic strips on paper this big and folded in half. This was before they settled on cutting those papers in half and folding them for a much smaller size. Well, those large reprints ended their run in 1979, and this publication of New Fun Comics #1 is the first one since that time, and even continues from where their old numbering system left off. This was created by scanning and digitally restoring DC Comics' only copy of one of the few remaining intact New Fun originals from 1935, which they did not purchase for their archives until 2019. And you can see what the untouched cover looks like here. Now, this issue was reprinted later that same year in 1935, along with issues 2, 3, and 4 in a publication called The Big Book of Fun Comics, but it never saw print again until 2020, 85 years later. Until next time. I'm looking at myself this whole time. Son of a